Have you ever wondered if you're praying the Rosary in a way that truly reaches heaven? Maybe you felt it. Those moments where you're holding the beads, saying the words, but deep down, something feels missing. You've been faithful, you've stayed committed. But despite your devotion, the deep spiritual transformation you've been longing for never quite arrives. There's a reason for this, and it's far more serious than most people realize. Today, you're going to discover something that could change everything you thought you knew about praying the Rosary. These are not minor mistakes or simple oversights. These are critical spiritual errors Padre Pio himself urgently warned us about. Errors that could be silently weakening your prayers, blocking their power, and creating a barrier between your heart and heaven's response, all without you realizing it. And what you're about to learn might be uncomfortable, but it could also unlock a profound transformation in your spiritual life. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and open your heart to this truth. Place your hand over your heart and say aloud, "Mother Mary, take my hand and lead me into the prayer heaven is waiting to hear." If your soul longs for this deeper connection, if you know you were meant to pray with the power of the saints, then commit right now. Hit the like button to seal this intention in your heart. Subscribe so you never miss another teaching that could transform your soul. And write "Lead me into prayer, Mother Mary" in the comments. This prayer is not just a beginning, it's a surrender. If your spirit feels drawn to these words, it's because heaven has already chosen you for this revelation. Stay until the end, because your prayer life is about to change forever. The first critical error Padre Pio warned about strikes at the very heart of how so many people misunderstand the Rosary itself. Maybe you've seen this before, a rosary dangling from a rearview mirror, wrapped around a wrist like a bracelet, or sitting at the bottom of a purse or pocket. These might look harmless, even devotional, but Padre Pio was clear. This is one of the most dangerous mistakes a believer can make. Treating the Rosary like a good luck charm, a talisman to ward off bad vibes, or bring blessings just by owning it, this strips the Rosary of its true power. The Rosary is not magical because of the beads themselves. Its power comes entirely from the prayers said with intention and the connection it creates between our hearts and heaven. Padre Pio called it a spiritual weapon, but weapons must be used, not just carried. Would a soldier be safe just because they carry a rifle slung over their shoulder without ammunition inside? Of course not. And yet, many Catholics fall into this very trap with the Rosary. It's become so common that people assume hanging a rosary in their home or keeping one in the car guarantees spiritual protection, even if they rarely or never actually pray it. It's like having a direct line to heaven, but never picking up the phone. The true power of the Rosary comes from prayer, deliberate, focused, heart-centered prayer. Each bead is meant to be a step forward in our journey toward God. Each Hail Mary is a sacred offering. When we reduce the Rosary to a decoration, we strip it of its real meaning. If you want to break free from this error, you must begin with intention. Before you even pick up your Rosary, pause. Remember what it truly is. Not a piece of jewelry or a spiritual insurance policy, but a lifeline to heaven. Instead of hanging it on your mirror, place it somewhere sacred. A small prayer box, a special pouch. When you take it out, kiss the crucifix. Whisper, "Lord, I believe in the power of this prayer." That small shift in intention reclaims the Rosary's true identity and starts every prayer from a place of faith. But this is only the beginning, because the second critical error Padre Pio warned about might be happening every single time you pray. Rushing through the Rosary. It sounds innocent. After all, we're still praying, aren't we? The words are said, the beads are counted. What's the harm? But Padre Pio was adamant on this point. A rushed Rosary, he said, is like trying to have a conversation while running past someone on the street. The words come out, but the connection is lost. Every Hail Mary, every Our Father, every Glory Be, each one should be like a jewel placed at the feet of Our Lady, not flung carelessly, but offered with care. This is the Rosary's secret power. When we slow down, when we treat each bead like a precious gift, something extraordinary happens. Our hearts begin to open. Our minds begin to quiet. We stop performing prayer and start entering prayer. Think about how often you've prayed the Rosary while driving, doing dishes, or trying to squeeze it into the cracks of a busy day. How often do your fingers race through the beads while your mind drifts to the grocery list or tomorrow's meeting? This rushed, distracted habit is more dangerous than you think, not because God refuses rushed prayers, but because you lose the opportunity to truly encounter Him. When you rush, you miss the deep contemplation the Rosary is designed to invite. Each mystery, Annunciation, Visitation, Nativity is meant to be a window into the life of Christ. A moment to pause, reflect, and step inside the story. But if we're flying through the prayers like items on a checklist, we slam that window shut. Padre Pio taught that praying the Rosary should be like sitting down for an audience with the Queen of Heaven herself. If Mary were physically sitting across from you, would you rush through your words? Would you glance at your phone, check your watch? Of course not. You'd slow down. You'd speak from the heart. You'd savor every moment. The solution requires a fundamental shift in how we see the Rosary. It's not a task to complete. It's an appointment with heaven. That means scheduling sacred, undistracted time, setting aside the phone, creating a space of peace, a candle, an icon, maybe soft music. It means showing up with reverence, the same way you'd show up to meet someone you deeply love and respect. When we approach the Rosary like this, each prayer becomes a gift, not an obligation. Each bead becomes a doorway into divine grace. The prayers stop rushing like a waterfall and start flowing like gentle raindrops, each one carrying the weight of our hearts toward heaven. And this shift, this simple shift, can transform your entire prayer life. But there's something even more dangerous than rushing your prayers. Because even if you slow down, even if you focus, the third error could still be quietly blocking the power of your Rosary. And this mistake cuts to the very heart of why so many prayers seem to go unanswered. Padre Pio warned that the Rosary was never meant to be treated like a divine ATM machine, a spiritual vending machine where we insert prayers and expect immediate results. That mindset doesn't just weaken our prayers, it warps our relationship with God itself. This is where the greatest transformation begins. When you stop using the Rosary to change God's mind and start using it to change your own heart, something shifts. The Rosary isn't about controlling heaven. It's about aligning yourself with heaven's will. And when you unlock that truth, your prayers no longer just rise, they pierce the clouds and reach directly into the heart of God. That's where we're going next. Stay with me. Because what Padre Pio revealed about this third mistake could change not only the way you pray, but the way you live. If you've made it this far, something inside you already knows. There's more to your Rosary prayers than you've ever been told. Maybe you've felt that pull before, that quiet whisper when you hold the beads, sensing the presence of heaven just out of reach. It's not your imagination. That's the spirit of prayer itself, calling you into something deeper, something sacred. And right now, that door is opening. Padre Pio understood something most people miss. The Rosary is not just a devotion. It's a spiritual transaction between heaven and earth. Each bead is a bridge, each prayer a movement of the soul toward God. But what happens when that movement is blocked? What happens when invisible walls stand between your prayers and the throne of grace? That's why the third error is so dangerous and so easily misunderstood. It's this: treating the Rosary like a spiritual ATM, a machine where you deposit prayers and expect heaven to instantly spit out solutions. It's subtle, isn't it? Because we've all been taught to bring our needs to God, to ask for help, to pray when we're in trouble. And that's not wrong, but Padre Pio warned there's a danger hidden beneath that instinct. When the Rosary becomes nothing more than a tool to get what we want, we sever its deepest power, the power to change us. This is where prayer transforms from human effort into divine encounter. The Rosary was never meant to change God's will. It was meant to align us with it. When you approach each bead, not with a demand, but with surrender, something unlocks, something ancient, something holy. The Rosary stops being a spiritual wish list and becomes a sacred conversation. One where you not only speak, but learn how to listen. And maybe you're wondering now, have I been doing this without even realizing it? Maybe you have. And if you have, that's not a reason for guilt. It's a reason for hope. Because the moment you recognize the error, you can correct it. Right now, you can shift. The very next time you hold the beads, you can begin with a different intention. Not give me, but change me. Not fix this, but form me. And when you do, you'll feel it. That shift, that opening, that sense that heaven is no longer distant, but suddenly present, like stepping from a dark room into the light. That shift is critical, because it prepares you for the fourth error, one Padre Pio called the most widespread spiritual trap of modern prayer. Praying mechanically, praying with lips that move while the heart stays silent, praying with fingers that slide over beads while the mind drifts through 1,000 other concerns. Have you ever caught yourself halfway through a decade, realizing you have no idea what you just prayed? That's not just distraction. That's disconnection. And it's exactly what the enemy wants. Because here's a truth no one talks about. The devil does not fear your rosary if it's prayed without presence. A distracted prayer is spiritually toothless. It's a car with no engine, a sword with no edge. And Padre Pio knew it. He said it bluntly. The devil laughs at prayers said without attention. Why? Because prayer was never meant to be a performance. It was meant to be a presence. Think about the people you love most. If you were speaking to them, sharing your heart, would you glance at your phone every few seconds? Would you rehearse the words without meaning them? Would you talk without caring whether they were truly listening? Of course not. Love demands presence, and prayer is no different. Every Hail Mary is not just a sentence, it's a step toward heaven. Every mystery is not just a story, it's a doorway into divine reality. When you pray the Rosary correctly, you are not just remembering events from the past. You are entering them, standing beside Mary at the Annunciation, walking with her to Elizabeth's door, kneeling at the foot of the cross. This is why the Rosary is so powerful, because it's not passive, it's participation. And if you're thinking, but I've prayed this way for years, how do I break the habit? Here's the secret Padre Pio knew. Intention breaks habit. Before you pray, pause, close your eyes. Picture Mary herself handing you the beads. See the light in her eyes. Hear her voice calling you into prayer, not as a chore, but as an encounter. And as you pray, slow down. With each bead, breathe. With each prayer, visualize. During the joyful mysteries, imagine the sounds and smells of Nazareth. During the sorrowful mysteries, feel the dust of the road to Calvary under your feet. When you engage all your senses, your prayer moves from the surface to the soul. This is the prayer that scares hell itself, not because it's long or complicated, but because it's real. It's alive. It's prayer that reaches heaven because it rises from the heart. And when that happens, something extraordinary takes place. The Rosary stops being something you get through and starts being something you walk into. It becomes less like reading a script and more like stepping into a holy conversation already happening in heaven. You're not just talking to God, you're talking with Him, and with Mary, and with the saints who prayed these same prayers long before you were born. The beads in your hands are a living chain, linking you to centuries of faith, unbroken and unstoppable. This is why Padre Pio called the Rosary his weapon. Not because the beads had power in themselves, but because prayer with presence is unstoppable. It pierces darkness, it shatters chains, it heals wounds, not because of the words alone, but because of the heart behind them. And here's where it gets even deeper. when you stop praying mechanically, when you stop using the rosary to get what you want and start using it to become who you're meant to be, your whole life begins to change. The way you speak changes. The way you see people changes. The way you handle suffering changes. Because the rosary doesn't just change circumstances, it changes you. And if that's what you've been longing for, real spiritual change, not just temporary relief, then you're already closer than you think. Because you're still here, you're still listening. And that's not an accident. Something in you already knows this is the path you were meant to walk. Something in you already hears that voice. Soft but clear, come deeper. That's the voice of heaven itself. That's the call to leave surface prayer behind and enter the deep. The deep where prayers become encounters and encounters become transformation. And if you're ready for that, stay close. Because there's still one more error left. The one Padre Pio said could silently undermine your entire spiritual life if left uncorrected. There's a reason you're still here. Something in your spirit knows that what you've been shown so far isn't just information. It's an invitation. An invitation into a way of praying that can shift not only your spiritual life, but the very atmosphere around you. And before we go deeper, before we reveal the final error that Padre Pio warned about, there's something you need to understand. The Rosary is not just a devotion. It is a conversation between heaven and earth, a bridge spanning the gap between your life and the eternal plan God has written for you. Every time you pray it, you are not just repeating ancient words. You are standing shoulder to shoulder with Mary herself, echoing her fiat, the very yes that opened the gates of salvation. When you hold those beads, you are gripping a spiritual lifeline held by countless saints before you. This is why the Rosary, prayed correctly, can change everything. And this is also why the fifth error is so dangerous, because it strikes at the very foundation of your spiritual life. The fifth error is this: using the Rosary as a substitute for the Holy Mass. At first it sounds harmless, even pious. After all, isn't the Rosary a powerful prayer? Doesn't Padre Pio himself call it his weapon? So why would relying on it be a mistake? The answer is simple, and yet so profound it shakes the very core of our faith. The Rosary was never meant to replace the Mass. No prayer, no matter how beautiful, no matter how powerful, can take the place of the Eucharist. Padre Pio spent hours every day celebrating the Mass with such intensity that those who witnessed it said it was like watching Christ suffer on the cross in real time. He knew, with unshakable certainty, that the Holy Mass is the pinnacle of all prayer, because it is not just our words rising to heaven, but heaven coming down to earth. The Mass is not a remembrance. It is not a ritual. It is a representation of Calvary itself. In every Mass, you stand at the foot of the cross. You witness the sacrifice of Christ made present again, timeless and eternal. The Rosary, as powerful as it is, prepares you for this encounter. It orients your heart. It teaches you to meditate, to focus, to surrender, but it does not and cannot replace it. Yet so many Catholics fall into this subtle trap. They miss Mass because they've prayed their Rosary. They treat their daily decades like a spiritual checkbox, assuming it exempts them from gathering at the altar. Even those who attend Mass sometimes allow the Rosary to become disconnected from the Eucharist, as if the two are separate devotions, rather than one continuous flow of grace. Padre Pio warned against this with urgency because he understood the hierarchy of spiritual power. One Mass, he said, has more value than all the rosaries ever prayed, not because the Rosary is weak, but because the Mass is Christ himself. The Rosary points to him. The Mass contains him. The Rosary is like reading a love letter. The Mass is like standing face to face with your beloved. Both are beautiful, but they are not the same. And maybe, as you hear this, something stirs in you. Maybe you felt the difference. Maybe you've left Mass feeling something profound, something no prayer at home could ever replicate. That's not your imagination. That's the reality of the real presence. That's the power of heaven breaking into earth, of eternity brushing against time. But here's the beauty of it. When you understand this relationship between the Rosary and the Mass, your prayer life doesn't shrink. It expands. Your Rosary becomes richer, fuller, more alive because it no longer stands alone. It becomes what it was always meant to be, a preparation for the altar and a continuation of the altar's grace. Imagine this rhythm, the Rosary leading you to the Mass pouring life into your Rosary, each prayer reinforcing the other, each encounter building upon the last. When you pray this way, every Hail Mary becomes an echo of the Eucharist. Every mystery becomes a window into the sacrifice made present at the altar. The Rosary no longer competes with the Mass, it completes it. This is how Padre Pio lived. This is how the saints prayed. And this is the path now opening before you. So what do you do with this? How do you begin to weave your Rosary and your Mass into a single, seamless garment of prayer? You start by making a choice, a deliberate choice to prioritize the altar. No matter how busy, no matter how tired, you choose to come to the table of the Lord. And when you cannot be there physically, you choose to unite your Rosary to the Masses being offered somewhere in the world, because at every moment, somewhere on this earth, the Eucharist is being celebrated. You can spiritually place your beads upon that altar, offering each prayer as a spiritual communion. When you pray this way, something shifts inside you. The Rosary is no longer just a devotion. It becomes a procession, a spiritual walk, leading you directly into the heart of the Eucharist. Every bead prepares you for communion. Every mystery draws you closer to the living sacrifice. The Rosary stops being something you do and becomes a way you live, and that's when the miracles begin. Because this is what Padre Pio wanted us to understand. The Rosary, when prayed correctly, does not just change your prayer life. It changes your whole life. It becomes a lens through which you see everything. Your struggles, your work, your family, your suffering. Everything becomes a mystery to contemplate, a prayer to offer, a path to the altar. This is why the saints did not just pray the Rosary, they lived it. And now that same invitation stands before you. So take this moment and decide. Will you let this teaching pass by, just another piece of information? Or will you let it plant a seed in your heart? The choice is yours. And the fruit of that choice could change not only your life, but the lives of everyone around you. If you're ready to walk this path, to truly unite your Rosary with the Mass, to let each prayer lead you to the altar, and each Mass fill your prayers with divine power, then make that decision today. Commit to attending Mass with the same devotion you bring to your beads. Pray your Rosary with the Eucharist in mind, and watch what heaven will do. If this truth has stirred something in your heart, if you know this message was meant for you, then share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone whose prayers have felt weak, someone who's been searching for deeper connection. You might be the very voice God uses to bring them back to the altar, and that is a grace beyond measure. There's something remarkable that happens when you begin to pray the Rosary the way Padre Pio taught. At first, the changes are subtle, almost easy to miss. A deeper stillness before you begin. A gentler way your fingers rest on each bead. A sense that you are no longer rushing through prayers, but stepping into something ancient, something sacred. And the more you pray this way, the more you realize you're not praying alone. It feels as though unseen hands are guiding you, unseen voices are praying with you. That's when you begin to understand you've entered into the living prayer of the Church itself, the unbroken stream of intercession that flows from earth to heaven and back again. This is no longer just your prayer. This is the prayer of the saints, the prayer of Mary, the prayer of Christ himself, echoed through every Our Father. And when this happens, the Rosary stops being a private devotion and becomes something far greater. It becomes a lifeline, not just for you, but for the world. Padre Pio often said that the Rosary is the weapon for these times. But what most people don't realize is that he was not only speaking about spiritual warfare in the world around us. He was speaking about the battles within us, the invisible struggles for focus, for faith, for surrender. The modern world pulls our attention in 1,000 directions. Even when we pray, we're tempted to multitask, to squeeze in our rosary between errands or half listen to the prayers while scrolling through our phones. But the rosary was never meant to be background noise. It was meant to be a threshold into the presence of God. And this is where we confront the most devastating consequence of these spiritual errors. When we pray, distracted, rushed, or mechanically, when we treat the rosary like a transaction or a replacement for the Mass, we train our souls into spiritual shallowness. Prayer becomes something we do instead of someone we become. And the fruits we long for, peace, clarity, transformation, remain just out of reach. That's why correcting these errors is not just about improving one prayer. It's about rewiring your entire relationship with God. Every time you slow down, every time you surrender your agenda, every time you enter prayer with reverence instead of routine, you're not just fixing your rosary, you are healing your heart. Padre Pio understood this because he lived it. His prayers were never disconnected from his life. When he held his rosary, it was not just in times of peace, but in times of suffering so intense it defies imagination. The stigmata in his hands bled every day. His body carried the physical wounds of Christ's crucifixion. And yet through it all, he held his beads. Not as a comfort object, but as a direct connection to the suffering and triumph of Christ himself. This is the rosary you are being invited into, not a soft prayer for quiet days, but a weapon forged in suffering and sanctified by grace. This is not a prayer for those seeking ease. It is a prayer for those seeking transformation. And the deeper you enter it, the more you realize the rosary is not about controlling circumstances. It's about preparing your soul to stand unshaken in the middle of them. And maybe you're thinking, but I've prayed for years and I still struggle. I still feel distant from God. I still fall asleep with the beads in my hand. If that's you, hear this. The struggle does not disqualify you. It qualifies you. The rosary is not meant to be mastered. It is meant to be lived, prayed through exhaustion, through distraction, through doubt. Every time you pick up the beads again, even after a distracted day, you are declaring to heaven and hell alike, I will not give up. This is why Padre Pio's greatest spiritual secret wasn't in his eloquence or his visions, or even his stigmata. It was in his persistence. He prayed the rosary not because every prayer felt powerful, but because every prayer, no matter how weak, was a seed sown in faith. Some days, the prayers bloom into profound encounters. Other days, they feel dry and empty. But every day, they rise to heaven like incense. And heaven responds, not always with the answers we expect, but always with the grace we need. This is the power of praying the rosary the way Padre Pio taught, not perfectly, but persistently, not rushing through it, but resting within it, not treating it as a charm, but as a conversation, not using it to replace the Mass, but letting it prepare you for it. When you pray this way, something incredible happens. The rosary no longer ends when you say Amen. It spills over into your life. You begin to notice moments of grace between prayers, conversations that feel guided, opportunities for mercy you would have missed before, sudden insights into your struggles that could only come from above. The rosary begins to weave itself into the ordinary fabric of your day until your whole life becomes a kind of living prayer. This is what Padre Pio meant when he said the rosary can change lives. Not because the beads themselves have power, but because the prayer opens you to the power of heaven itself. The rosary is a school of the heart, teaching you day by day how to see, how to love, how to surrender, not just in prayer, but in every moment. And if you're still here listening, something in you already knows this is true. Something in you recognizes that your spirit has been waiting for this invitation. You were not drawn to this message by accident. Heaven is calling you deeper, into a prayer life that is no longer about performance, but about presence. No longer about outcomes, but about union. No longer about praying for results, but about becoming someone who carries the presence of God wherever you go. This is the Rosary Padre Pio prayed. This is the Rosary the saints carried through darkness into light. And now, this is the Rosary being placed into your hands. The question is no longer whether you know how to pray it, but whether you are willing to live it. If you are ready to make that shift, to let your Rosary become not just a prayer you say, but a life you live, then there's only one thing left to do. Pick up your beads and begin. Every Rosary you've ever prayed has led you to this moment. Every bead that passed through your fingers, every whispered Hail Mary in the dark hours of the night, every prayer said with tears streaming down your face, none of it was wasted. Heaven saw every single one, even the distracted ones, even the rushed ones, even the ones you barely remembered finishing. But now something is different, because now you know the truth. You've been shown the path Padre Pio himself walked, the path where prayer is no longer about quantity, but about presence, no longer about performance, but about union. And once you know this truth, you can't unknow it. Once you've seen the door open, you can't pretend you haven't. Heaven has extended its hand. The question is, will you take it? Padre Pio's greatest teaching about the Rosary was never about perfection. It was about persistence in presence, showing up bead after bead, not because you feel holy, but because you believe heaven is listening, even when you don't feel it, especially when you don't feel it. This is what separates surface prayer from life-changing prayer, the willingness to sit at the feet of heaven, not demanding answers, but simply being present. And here's the secret few understand. When you pray this way, the Rosary starts to change you. The words become more than words. They become the language of your soul. The mysteries become more than stories. They become the lens through which you see your own life. The Rosary doesn't just bring you comfort, it brings you clarity. The kind of clarity that can only come when heaven itself speaks directly to your heart. Suddenly, the Annunciation isn't just Mary's story, it's your story. Learning how to say yes to the impossible. The crucifixion isn't just a mystery, it's your invitation to surrender your suffering, to let God transform your wounds into grace. The glorious mysteries aren't distant theology. They're your personal promise that no darkness is ever final, that resurrection is written into your story too. This is why the Rosary is a weapon, not because it changes God's plan, but because it teaches you how to trust it. Not because it forces heaven's hand, but because it opens yours. Not because it guarantees easy answers, but because it prepares you to walk even when the answers don't come. And if you felt spiritually dry, if you've wondered why your prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling, this is your answer. It was never about saying more prayers. It was about learning how to pray differently, with presence, with surrender, with the kind of trust that no distraction can shake. That's the path Padre Pio walked. That's the path the saints walked. And now it stands open before you. So now the decision is yours. Will you return to surface prayers, going through the motions, treating the Rosary like a task to complete? Or will you step fully into this ancient living prayer, the prayer that shaped saints, that shattered chains, that opened heaven itself? If you are ready to step into that prayer, to pray the Rosary the way heaven intended, then take action now. Don't just hear this teaching and move on. Claim it. Seal it into your spirit. Right now, hit the like button as an act of faith that this message was meant for you. Subscribe so you never miss another teaching that could shift your entire spiritual life. And in the comments, write "I will pray with presence," because sometimes writing it down is the first act of surrender. And one more thing. Share this message with someone who needs it. Someone whose prayers have felt dry. Someone who's lost their way with the Rosary. You have no idea whose life could change because you chose to pass this truth along. You might be the very voice God uses to call them back to prayer, back to presence, back to Him. Remember what Padre Pio always said: pray hope, and don't worry. The Rosary, prayed with presence, isn't just a prayer. It's a lifeline, a weapon. And for those who choose to pray this way, it is the pathway home.